It's hard to explain the feelings that emerge when your family betrays you. Anger, disappointment, and sadness coil together into a venomous tangle that clogs your throat, making you feel both weak and incredibly, dangerously strong at the same time. That's exactly how I felt when my uncle deceived me out of my rightful share of my father's estate. But I didn't stop at feeling. I took action, and my uncle had no idea what was coming. I should start from the beginning. When I was just 16, my father died in a tragic accident. He had always been careful, almost to a fault, but all it took was one drunk driver to turn a regular Tuesday night into a nightmare. One minute, my dad was driving home from work, listening to his favorite 80s rock mix, and the next, he was gone. My world shattered that night, and it never quite glued back together. Since it was just me and my mom left, my uncle, Dad's brother, stepped in to help out. I thought it was generous. Uncle Mark was always around, bringing groceries, mowing our lawn, and even covering some of our bills until we got back on our feet. It made sense. Dad and Mark had been close, and Mark owned a small but successful construction business. He could afford to help us, and I believed his gestures were from the heart. After a year, things seemed to settle. I graduated high school, and we were doing okay financially. My father had left behind a sizable estate, the house, investments, savings, and even a little piece of land in Vermont that we visited during holidays. But it wasn't until I turned 18 that things began to unravel. I remember the day my uncle came by the house holding a stack of documents. He said he had been helping Mom take care of Dad's estate and had some papers for me to sign. He smiled in his usual way, a friendly, toothy grin, and insisted it was just a formality, some bureaucratic nonsense to make everything easier. "You don't want to get tangled in all the tax details and legal mess, do you?" He chuckled. The way he framed it, I felt silly, even hesitating. I trusted him. He had always been there for us, had helped us through the darkest days of our lives. So, without much thought, I scribbled my name on those documents. In retrospect, I was naive. I should have read them, but who thinks of reading pages and pages of legal jargon when you're dealing with someone who calls you kiddo and helped fix the leaky roof without being asked? It was only a year later that I began to realize what I'd done. The first inkling of trouble came when I decided to sell the piece of land in Vermont to help pay for my college tuition. It wasn't an emotional decision. I loved that place, but I knew my father would have wanted me to use it to invest in my future. However, when I called the county office to inquire about the deed, the lady on the phone informed me that the land was no longer in my name. In fact, it was no longer even in my mother's name. It belonged to my Uncle Mark. I remember sitting there staring at my phone in disbelief. I could barely understand what she was saying. I had never given up that land, and neither had Mom. I hung up and called Uncle Mark immediately. He didn't answer. I called again and again, until eventually I got a text. "Busy now. We'll call later." He never called back. It took me a few days of digging to realize just how deep the betrayal ran. Not only had Uncle Mark transferred the Vermont property to his own name, but he had also manipulated me into signing away my share of Dad's savings and investments. Everything that should have been split between my mother, myself, and him was now largely in his control. My mother was devastated. She blamed herself, but I refused to let her sink into that guilt. It wasn't her fault. It was mine for guilt. It wasn't her fault. It was mine for trusting the wrong person. But rather than wallow in regret, I decided to do something about it. And that's when I began to dig. I started with Uncle Mark's business. I'd always thought of him as a hardworking man, someone who built his construction company from the ground up. But the more I looked, the more I found discrepancies. Lawsuits that had mysteriously disappeared, complaints from former employees that were somehow never followed up on, and then there was the most interesting thing, a name that kept popping up in connection with Mark's business dealings, James Callahan. I didn't know who James Callahan was, but I was determined to find out. After weeks of searching, late nights on internet forums, and combing through public records, I finally hit the jackpot. James Callahan had been a contractor, one who went bankrupt after taking a deal with Uncle Mark. Apparently, Mark had convinced James to front a massive project, promising payment upon completion, but when the time came to pay up, Mark vanished, leaving James financially ruined. I found James living in a small town about 2 hours away. It took some convincing, but eventually he agreed to meet me. He was a hollow version of the man I had imagined, thin, with sunken eyes and a wary demeanor. When I explained who I was, his face darkened, and for the first time in a long while, he seemed to come alive. "Mark took everything from me," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "He promised me the world and left me with nothing." It wasn't hard to convince James to help me. Together, we started gathering evidence, emails, contracts, even witness statements from others Mark had cheated. Piece by piece, we built a case that showed Mark for who he truly was, a con artist hiding behind a friendly smile and a family man image. But I knew that simply exposing him legally wasn't enough. Mark had stolen from me, from my mother, and had taken advantage of my grief. I wanted to make sure he felt the consequences in every aspect of his life. The first step was to confront him directly. I waited until Thanksgiving, knowing he would show up at my mother's house for dinner, as he did every year. I'll never forget the look on his face when I walked in, James Callahan by my side, and dropped a stack of documents in front of him. "You thought you could steal from your own family and get away with it?" I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. Mark's face turned an ashen color, his eyes flickering from me to the papers and then to James. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. My mother, sitting at the head of the table, looked at him with tears welling in her eyes. She didn't say anything either. She didn't need to. The betrayal was written across her face. "You're going to sign everything back," I continued. "The land, the savings, every single thing you took from us. And if you don't, well, I think James here might enjoy seeing you in court." Mark tried to bluster his way out of it, but it was no use. We had too much evidence and he knew it. He signed the documents that night, his hand shaking as he did so. But that wasn't the end of it. After that night, I contacted every person I could find who had ever been wronged by Mark. I connected them with lawyers, shared the evidence we had gathered, and made sure that Mark's shady dealings were brought to light. His business crumbled under the weight of lawsuit after lawsuit. Contracts were canceled, clients backed out, and soon enough, Mark was left with nothing. But the most satisfying moment came a few months later when I received a letter from James. He had managed to get back on his feet thanks to the settlement he won against Mark. He thanked me for giving him a second chance, for helping him when no one else would. I didn't destroy Mark out of spite, at least that's what I tell myself. I did it because people like him shouldn't be allowed to get away with their lies and manipulation, especially not when it comes to family. He thought he could take advantage of my trust, my grief, and walk away unscathed. But he underestimated me, and that was his biggest mistake. Today, the Vermont land is back in my name. I haven't sold it. Instead, I've started building a small cabin there, a place where I can go to remember my dad, away from the chaos of the world. My mother visits often, and we talk about the good times, the holidays we spent there as a family, the hikes, the laughter. As for Mark, I don't know where he is now, and frankly, I don't care. The last I heard, he had sold his house to cover legal fees and was renting a small apartment somewhere out of state. He tried to reach out once, sent a letter apologizing, but I never read it. Some betrayals cut too deep to be mended with words. In the end, I learned something valuable through all of this. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by trust, by love, and by the people who stand by you when the rest of the world falls apart. My uncle may have shared my last name, but he was never truly my family. And I'm okay with that. Because now, I have my life back, my mother by my side, and the knowledge that no one, not even someone I once trusted, will ever take advantage of us again. A few years have passed since that confrontation with Uncle Mark, and my life has taken unexpected turns. I graduated college with a degree in business, and I've used everything I learned, both in school and through my ordeal with Mark, to build something of my own. I now run a small consulting firm, helping others who have faced financial deception or betrayal. The clients who come to me have stories similar to mine, family betrayals, shady business partners, and false friends. It's satisfying to give them the tools they need to fight back, to take control of their lives again. One day, I received an unusual call. It was from a woman named Rebecca, who introduced herself as Mark's estranged daughter, my cousin. I had only met Rebecca a handful of times when we were children, and I knew that her relationship with her father had always been strained. She told me she had heard about what happened between Mark and me and wanted to meet. Curiosity got the best of me, so I agreed. We met at a small cafe downtown, and Rebecca was almost unrecognizable from the little girl I remembered. She was grown now, with a determined set to her jaw and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of someone far older. She looked at me with a mix of uncertainty and hope, and I could sense there was something important she needed to say. "I know what my dad did," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "And I wanted to apologize. I know it's not my fault, but I feel like I need to make things right." I was taken aback. I had spent so long viewing Mark as the enemy, as someone irredeemable, that I had forgotten there were people connected to him who might have suffered just as much as I had, if not more. Rebecca went on to explain how her father's actions had driven a wedge between them, how she distanced herself after realizing he wasn't the man she thought he was. "I don't want anything from you," she said, her eyes earnest, "but I heard that you're helping people now, people who have been deceived, just like us. I want to be part of that. I want to do something good with all the pain he caused." It was a moment I hadn't anticipated. I could see the sincerity in Rebecca's face, the way she wanted to take the darkness of her father's legacy and transform it into something meaningful. And in that instant, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I could let go of the anger I had carried for so long. Not for Mark, he didn't deserve it, but for the people like Rebecca who had been caught in the crossfire. I decided to give her a chance. Rebecca began working with me, helping me expand my consulting firm into a nonprofit organization aimed at providing free legal aid and financial education to those who needed it most. It wasn't easy. There were times when I questioned my decision, times when the old bitterness threatened to resurface, but seeing the difference we were making kept me going. Rebecca and I became close, bonded by our shared pain and our desire to turn it into something positive. Together, we helped countless families, individuals who were lost and broken, just like I had once been. And in doing so, I found a new kind of family, one built not on betrayal, but on trust, resilience, and hope for a better future. Mark's betrayal had once shattered me, but from the shards of that pain, I built something stronger, something worthwhile. And though I could never forget what he had done, I finally found a way to move forward, to create something good from the wreckage he left behind. And that, I think, is the best kind of revenge.